Supervisory Board, Dr. Suni Umul Firdaus, Director of the Center for Democracy Studies and National Resilience, Professor Dr. Ko Ying Hoi from Universitas Malaya, dear participants of this truly international conference. While regretting to not be able to be physically in Solo, I am very glad and honored to be part of this interesting conference and look forward especially for the discussion later on. Elections and electoral democracy is an important and obviously very timely topic for Indonesia, but also a neighboring Thailand. We just have formed a government after elections. And we see also elections coming in very important countries in Asia, namely in Bangladesh and in India. So talking about elections, we will, when elections are approaching, very much focus in our discussion on the challenges to realize them as smooth as possible. And we might be tempted to reflect very much on the challenges of the organization of elections. And here we have a long range of possible issues that might hampering the integrity of elections as a process. Think of election irregularities and election corruption, undue influences of voters, including by fake news and digital means, an insufficient provision of civil liberties as they are necessary to enable free and equal elections, unfair conditions for contending candidates or parties, acts of violent disruption of campaigning or voting, and so on. So I want to highlight, I refer here generally on problems election might face, and I think Indonesia is comparatively well off here. I think the start of the campaign is, I see it more positive than we heard it before, but this is not the topic I would like to address. So these and other problems concerning the integrity of elections and the ways to address them are important. They are in the limelight when we have elections, but I think it is important to see also the more structural problems of democracy and elections and their link. And I think there we have to talk about something which is right now in our world a general problem in many societies. So what I would like to do is I would like to see if I can link what is widely described as a crisis of democracy in our contemporary world in many countries to the conceptual meaning and functioning of elections in a democratic society. So I will take a step back from the realities of ongoing campaigning and ongoing election processes. What I want to try is I will try to explore and how far we can see, if you look at elections, where are the problems in the democratic process in general, and in how far we can use elections as a kind of analytical tool to understand what we might expect in the future from the democratic system. And there, again, we are talking about what is labeled as a crisis of democracy. And this crisis of democracy has been observed for many times. So we had frequently, every some decades, we have this talk on the crisis of democracy. Very famous is, for example, a report on the crisis of democracy in the 1970s of the Trilateral Commission. And now again, we have this discourse in many publications. And basically, this is observed in, I would say, even most Western countries and a lot of non-Western countries. So when we talk about the crisis of democracy or the challenges democracy is facing on a systemic level, I will not focus here on all the cases where we have a manifest democratic backsliding towards authoritarian systems. So that is something we can observe too. We had recently a series, for example, of coups d'etats in West Africa. And we have a lot of examples where societies turn formally from being a democracy into an authoritarian system or dictatorship. That's also not the topic. So I will take the middle ground. I will focus really on the functioning democracies and the tendencies of these democracies to provide less trust in the system and to provide less stability for the process. Among the most frequent descriptions of this process of a decline of democratic coherence or democratic success, performance, we find at first glance a rise of polarizing forces that is very often observed, a rising populism, and an increasing loss of confidence in democratic politics by the people. One or several of these factors we find significantly increasing, as I said, in many Western political communities, such as in the United States, in Germany, in Italy, Greece, Spain, France, the UK, basically many others too. And here we experience this trend vis-à-vis grant policy issues like negative economic developments, the handling of migration, the consequences of the COVID pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the consequences of this. And at the same time, we see also in many of these societies that societal discourse seems to be more polarized, while the traditional party system is losing legitimacy, momentum, and persuasive power. Many worrying in some countries even that the democratic system as such, as it is constitutionally established, or at least that some of its constitutional ground rules are also losing legitimacy and public support. When we look at these processes, I want to make one thing clear first. Every kind of governance, democracy and any other else, is developing in cycles. So we will always see rising politics or declining politics that is coming and going. So I don't want to say that democracy is sick and will never recover. I think that would be wrong. But what we can say is we have a problem. And I would like to have a closer look at these observations and at this problem and try to highlight the pattern of this trend of a current decline of electoral democracy, not everywhere, but in an increasing number of countries. So what are these patterns? First of all, we have the problem of a democratic disconnect. That means we have an increasing display of a lack of trust in and support of established parties, mainstream public discourse, as it is often phrased by critics. That means many people are criticizing the parties, the big parties. They don't trust them anymore that much. Many people don't trust also the public discourse, the mainstream media. Then the electoral process. So many people in these societies have more doubts of the electoral process than they used to have before. And lastly, in some of these countries, we see even a lacking trust or a lacking support for constitutional identity and what we could call the social contract. That's one problem, the democratic disconnect. The second problem, the second pattern is growing polarization. So what we see here is we see growing polarization in the society. In most of these societies, segments of the societies can't talk to each other anymore in the way they used to be able to do so in the past. We also see, in terms of polarization, a lack of programmatic identity of parties and a rising populism. In France, for example, some years ago, there was a survey and the result was, for me, quite surprising. More than 70 people surveyed found that the left-right distinction of political parties is not anymore playing any role. That's surprising. Almost 2/3 of the people in France, which is a country in which political programs are very important for the political process, said not anymore. So this is very, very significant. Indeed, we don't have only the convergence of political camps, we have sometimes even what we might at least experience as a flipping of ideological preferences. What do I mean with that? So one thing is, we see that parties that used to have very different political standpoints are now having basically the same ideas, but even more, sometimes we have even parties that we would identify with a certain policy, and it's exactly adopting the opposite policy and vice versa. So this is all leading to increased polarization also on the political level. sooner or later, because in a system in which the voters don't see anymore a program of their party followed, and that is what they base their voting decision on. So when we vote, we want to at least somehow anticipate what the party we are voting for is doing in the future. And if this is not happening, then we are having the first problem. We have the democratic disconnect, a lack of trust, and that is then leading to the response of politics to resort to populism. So parties will do then everything they can do to regain the trust. When they do that, however,